If you care about longevity, you should care about being able to recreate yourself in some form, and basically by pumping out as much data as humanly possible, right? Like that is a form of immortality in some ways. Like dojacat is like the most like no filter pop star that we've ever had. She's just tweeting about like all sorts of weird shit on a Saturday night, and it's like, well, she's got a larger streaming base than Taylor Swift, so maybe like polish isn't what we are in the market for in this day and age. The idea of like inheriting digital goods on the web is so incoherent that like we haven't even begun to even dumb shit like your Facebook profile, like, ooh, do you want to give it to me? Like, it's a weird question. He brought like a printout of the source code of Ethereum on our honeymoon in 2013, and I was just well, if you can't beat them, you join them, right? So.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our podcast. I am super pleased to have Kathleen Breitman, co-founder of Tezos, and also somebody with a lot of experience in traditional finance, worked at Accenture, Bridgewater, the Wall Street Journal, graduated from Cornell. Ithaca is gorgeous. And I'd be happy to hear about your story. And maybe perhaps we'd love to kick it off by doing an intro of yourself as well as your journey to crypto.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, my name is Kathleen Breitman. That's my married name. My husband is also my co-founder of my project, Tezos, which is a cryptocurrency. Basically, Tezos was born out of the observation that Bitcoin lacks a mechanism to upgrade itself. So back in 2013, before Bitcoin was super popular the way it is today, there were a lot of innovations in computer science coming to the fore, and oftentimes these were introduced through new cryptocurrencies taking hold. So a famous example is Zcash, which is basically a cryptocurrency that's very similar to Bitcoin, but it can provide anonymous transactions. The Zcash developers, or the initial developers of Zcash, basically went to the core developers of Bitcoin way back in the day and offered their support to include anonymous transactions into Bitcoin. And basically the Bitcoin devs were like, no, we're good. Now, granted, like, whether or not this was the correct choice is kind of like a matter of debate. But I guess the point that stuck with my husband and I at the time is like, hey, this should be something that like token holders have a say in, not just like an oligopoly, right, of core developers, because they don't always know what makes, a great cryptocurrency, or they don't always know what makes like great features. And so basically the idea was to create a cryptocurrency that had a natural forum for ratifying amendments to the protocol. And the idea behind this was to make it future-proof against, basically you have a snapshot of the technology that's available to you when you launch cryptocurrency, and you should be able to like basically iterate on that without a lot of contention, and basically living by the whims of a central organization or a central group of people. So Tezos does like a very radical version of this, whereby if you own a token in the network, you have a say in the direction of the protocol. And this sounds a little bit silly in the sense that like people have not been really high on democracy for the last few years, but honestly like a lot of the a lot of the improvements have been like basically technical improvements to the protocol, which I think are close to what you call in finance like secular goods. Like obviously you want the blockchain to go faster, so on and so forth. We haven't gotten to like really good meaty debates the way that you do in a proper polity, but I think that's coming to the fore over the next few years as the technology improves. But that's the genesis behind Tezos, and as I mentioned, it's something that was born of an observation that like really was crystallized in 2013, because we saw a lot of innovation happening. At the time, I was working in traditional finance. I was working at a hedge fund called Bridgewater, and I really didn't like working at Bridgewater. And so I went knee deep into like whatever my husband was talking about at the time, which happened to be cryptocurrencies. He brought like a printout of the source code of Ethereum on our honeymoon in 2013. And I was just like, well, if you can't beat them, you join them, right? So I think everyone has this moment in a marriage where it's like, you're crossing the Rubicon in something, like whether or not it's like taking on someone's new hobby or like deciding to tolerate their choices in music. And for me, like cryptocurrency was something where I was like, well, this does seem pretty interesting. And I don't think Arthur's going to shut up about this for anytime soon. And indeed, he has not since. And so it was a good choice for me to kind of immerse myself in this. And yeah, I just found it like really interesting in a way that is provocative and also like a little silly, and it's reflective of a lot of things I like, namely the internet. So yeah, that's kind of my journey into crypto. It's like I joke that I married into it, but it's a little bit more intellectually noble than that, but it's not by much.
Well, I mean, if you brought the printout of the source code on your honeymoon, I mean, that definitely is, I guess, I don't know how stronger of a definition you can get to marrying into it, but that is pretty incredible. I'm just so curious about that. So where did you guys go on your honeymoon? And did you guys actually, like, was that actually like bedtime reading?
Yeah.
Or,
Well, the thing is, like,
or brunch discussion?
So for our honeymoon, like I like traveling a lot, and so does my husband. And we had been to a few places that we had really liked together during our courtship, and we wanted to pick a place that was like completely out of left field, that we would probably never otherwise have an excuse to go to. So we went on safari in Botswana, and in South Africa, but mostly Botswana. And we went to a bunch of different camps, and we like were in this like little, I don't know if you've ever been on safari, but it is.
I have. Yeah, it's great. Divine experience.
And you get to like take these like tiny little Cessnas everywhere. And so you didn't have a lot of luggage room. So the fact that Arthur brought a printout was a little bit of like, at first I was like, oh, come on, man. You could have fit at least like 10 more linen shirts in your suitcase with that. But yeah, no, we did that for about 2.5 weeks. And honestly, we were pretty much, we were good on elephants after that. I think I filled my elephant quota for my life. It was really fun. And so I don't think he actually got around to reading it, but it is really funny that he brought it with him. I do remember like we were pretty much exhausted by the end of it each day.
That's amazing. Well, thanks very much for telling me about that journey. I mean, I think one of the, just amazing things is you pointed out, Tezos has done so many innovations, but of course, self-amendment, improvement, governance, and proof of stake. I think those are all things that, were not seen as sort of, they were not consensus, let's put it that way, in the sense that I think a lot of people had doubts. I'm curious, in those early days, as you're going around, I'm not sure if you hit up Sand Hill Road at all or talk to people. Were people very supportive at the time of the beginning, or was there skepticism? I'd be curious to hear, or a little mix of both.
No, it's a good part of the story. So, yes and no is the short answer. Effectively, like a lot of this was done in stealth. So in effect, the Tezos position paper was posted on, the cryptocurrency cryptography mailing list where Bitcoin was announced in 2014, the way that Bitcoin was announced, with a white paper. And there was a little bit of buzz on the internet, but like honestly, there was a group of PhDs beavering away on the code base in France, but there wasn't that much else there, other than the enthusiasm of a few novice developers, professional developers with like sort of a novice hobby. For about 2 years, development went on, and very few people kind of paid attention to it because it wasn't public. And then in September 2016, I think there was a GitLab post of like all the code that had been written to date, which I think was like 15,000 lines or something like that. It's like, boop, there we go. It was very much a Beyonce style drop, except unlike a Beyonce style drop, no one actually paid attention to it. And so I quit my job in October of that year. I had met up with a friend for coffee, and he was like super knowledgeable about the space. And he was just like, why aren't you doing this full time? He's like, what's wrong with you? And I was like, yeah, it's a good question. What is wrong with me? And that could probably fill a much longer hour, but all it's to say, I was just like, yeah, basically a lot of what is talked about in the Tezos position papers basically came true in the interim time between 2014 and 2016. So if you read the Tezos position paper, it talks about a few things. It talks about the risk of having very gregarious developers kind of dictate the mission or vision for a project, as opposed to like people who actually own the token and have some stake in it. This kind of came to the fore with the block size debates in 2014 and 2015, which are after the Tezos position paper. And so that was very prescient. And then another thing that the Tezos position paper discusses is the importance of formal methods for verifying, the correctness of code. And that really came to the fore with the Ethereum DAO hack of 2016. So honestly, and subsequently to that, basically the Ethereum developers kind of got together and decided that they would fork Ethereum, which is, well within their rights to do, clearly. But again, like it wrangled a lot of that community so that Ethereum Classic took off, albeit very briefly. And it kind of basically validated a bunch of different hypotheses, or I guess claims in the Tezos position paper. And so basically in 2016, everyone was like, what happened to those Tezos guys? There was like a paper from IOHK, which is like the company that I guess built Cardano, that like, straight up plagiarized part of it. And I was just like, oh, come on. It was a lot of like, oh yeah, those Tezos guys were onto something. Like, whatever happened to them? I guess I came out swinging like 2017, starting to promote the project a bit more, and talking about its ideas behind it. We didn't really do the Sand Hill Road thing because there was basically a knee-jerk reaction against any VC funding in the cryptocurrency space. So anything that had insiders was seen as suspect. There is the crypto that like basically died in its infancy, subject to a lot of conspiracy theories about VCs being behind it, so on and so forth. And so we took that like enormously seriously. So we didn't really do much, but like a lot of, very nice VCs were certainly interested in the project, but like Arthur and I were really not that interested in meeting with them ourselves. The only person who I kind of entertained for this was Tim Draper, just because I met him and I just really got along well with him. So we sold him like a small stake in our parent company for the code base that we had been building. That was like May of 2017. And honestly, that was just like, I think closed within 48 hours. It was just like, Tim's awesome. I love Tim. I want this dude on my side. And I want to be able to talk to him like whenever. And honestly, like that was the best probably management decision I ever made. So short answer is like, it was really an anathema in 2017. So Arthur and I kind of, didn't really think that was a big part of the project. We really believed in the Swiss nonprofit model that was stewarded by the Ethereum Foundation in 2014. And so we thought it was really important that like it was mostly something that was very organic and grassroots. The VC class has a tendency to kind of be a bit ham-fisted about the way that they engage with cryptocurrency projects in a way that I find kind of destructive and a little bit odious. And Tim really got it. Like Tim was kind of the guy who proved us wrong, and he immediately grokked a lot of the stuff that we were talking about, and I just had a great relationship with him. So that was kind of the bit of a journey we went through.
I have so many questions that come from everything you just said, but I'll try to highlight a few. I mean, one thing actually that is interesting, right? Because in many ways, we could think of the types of disruptive innovations that are occurring due to cryptocurrency or due to the rise of blockchain, whether in finance or traditional finance, but also investing, the buy side, which of course is very different. And actually, twice now you've mentioned sort of let's call it hesitation to say good things about things on the buy side, right? So both in a VC context and a hedge fund context. So I'm curious if you give, I'd love to sort of explore like what are some of the things we think are problematic about what's going on with maybe their intersection with crypto, or maybe just problematic in general.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Well, I think like venture capital is a really great tool for a lot of entrepreneurs. I'm not trying to dismiss it out of turn. It's more like, I think a lot of what's good about open source development is that there's a lot of a tinkering hobbyist aspect to it. And I think the second that you get sort of professional investors involved in like trying to, will a crypto into existence, all of a sudden, like the tone changes and you start to like, kind of get these Web 2.0 entrepreneurs coming in and they're trying to recreate their like old shitty companies with like a Web 3 bend. And it just feels very manufactured. Whereas one of the most popular applications on the Tezos blockchain, which again, like completely for more or less eschewed any of this like sort of VC talk, is a website called Hikiknunk, which was created at a hackathon in Brazil by like a 22-year-old who like, I think is, systemically deleted every single VC solicitation thereafter. And what's nice about Hikiknunk is that it's not a very polished website, or in its early days, it was not very polished. And consequently, like it kind of attracted a lot of people who didn't want to go on the VC-backed NFT platforms that are super popular because, they try to like promote all of the sales that they've done and all of like the sort of big ticket items that have, sold for $750,000, then, again, for 6.6 million, like, kind of that's like their model, right? Like they have to make returns for their VCs. Whereas Hikiknunk was like so organic and dorky that all the actual programmers went to it and basically they treated it as though it was scaffolding. And then they built a building around it. And they built like, developer tools, and they have like galleries that sit on Hikiknunk. And it's become wildly popular as a consequence of that. And so I think that, the tinkering aspect of this is kind of lost when you get people who basically have, VC style, Silicon Valley style expectations coming in. Not to say that it's exclusively a bad thing or exclusively a good thing, but I do think the fact that many other cryptocurrency projects that have come to the fore in like 2019, 2020 were almost exclusively VC backed has created a sort of inorganic language around this that used to be very much like hackers doing like hackish things. Yeah, so that's just my 2 cents. Maybe I'm just bitter because, Tezos is not really known as being like a VC project, but if I have to pick a tone, I love like the tinkering aspect of this a lot more than I do the sort of slick websites and like PowerPoints with, hockey sticks and things like that.
That's right. That's right. I'm definitely with you on that. And actually building on some of the things you said, I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating is that, when you look at some of the DeFi protocols, for example, not to be named explicitly, but, they have these leaderboards of who has the most amount of their governance tokens. I was kind of looking through those for, let's say, one of the DeFi protocols. And I was surprised at like traditional VCs, Web 2 VCs that are turning into Web 3 VCs. Many of them were like stock right at the top of those leaderboards, right? Meaning that they had a big say in how those protocols develop. And, a lot of people in crypto pull the banner of, okay, we're doing new things. We're going to break with the establishment. And I was looking at some of these DeFi protocols and I was like, well, basically the establishment control a lot of the governance tokens of these DeFi protocols. I was like, are we just getting a redux, right? Because it's just like, the rich get richer, the established, become more established. I found that surprising. I just was looking in the back at some of these leaderboards, and the way governance even works there is so interesting, right? That just the way people bring proposals up, but we can talk about that part later. But I'm curious if any of that, what I just said, resonates about about the establishment getting into crypto in obviously a big way, just because of the attention.
Yeah, no, listen, it's not a bad, I do think cryptocurrencies are like particularly revolutionary for exchanging value on the web. I think they solve like a, centuries old problem. Huge fan, obviously. And if you're an investor, you obviously should be, looking at it because it's something that's cool and provocative, right? I guess my criticism, if there is one in there, is mostly towards like the spirit that it betrays, which is, I think, just like a bit antagonistic to the idea of like being okay with failure, being okay with like kind of having something a little hacky at first and like playing with it and making it part of a community and having people kind of like homestead a little bit, in the digital version of it. And I think that's much more powerful because like if people have a sense of ownership over the protocol, they really connect to it more. So like even though Tezos is not the largest project in the cryptocurrency space, it is one of the most engaged communities that you'll ever find. We have basically a really high threshold for quorum to be met in order for any proposal to be ratified. And I think it's, somewhere hovers between like 80% of token holders have to be represented in order for this to happen. And the protocols hit that the networks hit that every single time. So it's like a wonderfully engaged community. And I think you'll be hard pressed to find a more passionate group of advocates. But it's not because like, so-and-so, promised me X, return or whatever. It's very much just because like they love the spirit of it. And I think I think that has greater grounds for longevity. I just know that like the path that or the tenor that has taken upon us in this Tezos community is something I'm particularly proud of. It's not the trendiest thing in the world right now, but it's definitely like unimpeachably honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to say that for all projects. So I think that's extremely admirable. I think, we talked a little bit about governance, right? And it's interesting. I'm going to go back to my other analogy. So not Tezos, but, looking at the way some of these protocols are developing from a politics and governance perspective, you can't help but get the feeling that some of them, right, feel certainly more like a plutocracy than a democracy, right? For obvious reasons. I think you mentioned the block size war, right? That wasn't even a plutocracy. That was just an odd way of, like you have to get the miners and like, the Bitcoin core developers and just the way that they were. that was just such a fascinating exercise. So I'm glad we've moved to a point where we've sort of learned obviously from things like that. But, I'm looking at improvement proposals on, let's say different protocols. And it's like, I remember the stablecoin was trying to get on the platform, a DeFi platform. And they came with like, buying an absurd amount of that coin. Right. And they said, we come bearing, gifts effectively. Right. We come bearing all this money. Can we get on your platform effectively? Right. It was maybe a little more complicated words than that. But I mean, you know, the modern world sort of, I guess we sort of believe democracy is the best form of government, you know, per the Winston Churchill quote, right? Except all the others, the worst form of government, except all others that have been tried, maybe is a better way to say it. But yeah, I mean, what kind of government models do we think will emerge? And of course, you know, famously Plato, way back in the day, hated democracy, thought it was like the worst thing in the world, right? So, you know, lots of thoughts about what works and what doesn't. I mean, are we seeing a sort of a largely plutocratic system develop in the blockchain space, or do we see other models emerge?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And like, yeah, I mean, I don't think the goal is democracy in the sense that I don't think the goal is that everyone gets a voice. It just happens to be the case. It's effectively to bootstrap, right? And so what's cool about Tezos is that the governance model itself is like, sort of self-amending. And so if we decide that like, you know what, we tried this whole like representation with token holders, nice try, but actually we just want like, you know, this address to control everything, like there is a mechanism to do it. I think it betrays a spirit that again is not befitting of the project writ large. But it is a thing you can do, you know, if we ever give up on it. So I hold an Irish passport, so I shouldn't be saying anything nice about monarchies, but I do think there's something kind of nice about the fact that like monarchies don't filter for sociopaths as actively as democracies do. I think that, you know, a fair amount of what politics translates into is like personality filtering. And in that respect, like, I think that's why some of mainstream politics are so odious, is because like the types of people who I, you know, knew in college who went into politics later were like the people I do not want in charge, but who really want to be in charge, right? There's a lot of Ambrose Biercean quotes around this. But, and I think they're all very true. I think when it's a technical project, you kind of have to suspend like whatever political beliefs you have, and you have to think about it more of like, you know, getting the best decisions for the technology. And I do think that a lot of what's become bad about the cryptocurrency space is basically like over-indexing on what engineers say and not thinking about like terminal goals as clearly as a consequence of this. So there's my husband and I joke that like people lose like 50 IQ points whenever they talk about blockchain, and it's like all of a sudden like their brains just fall out, and like anything pragmatic they might have thought, you know, with something else, it's like the opposite. It's a form of Gelman amnesia, right? Like you read the paper about something you're an expert in, and you're like, that's shit, and then you turn the page and you're just like, oh, interesting. Like nope. Like most people, you know, kind of wouldn't pass your own test in the area where you're an expert. And all that's to say, like, I do think like there's a little bit of like mythology around sort of like the sort of benevolent engineer that's come into this that I think is like absolutely hilarious, because you don't really have that so much in any other technical space. Like everyone hates Mark Zuckerberg because he's a benevolent engineer, and everyone always assumes that he's like trying to upend democracy instead of just like, you know, making some sort of social ranking website that kind of went awry. But all that's to say, like, I think people attribute a lot more like noble virtue to like engineers in this space than perhaps is warranted. I do think it tends to over-index. So what's nice about democracy or you know, techno version of democracy in Tezos is that I think it forces the engineers to actually have to explain themselves. It's not just like, oh, you know, so-and-so proposed this, like, and they're geniuses and they have access to the, you know, GitHub repo, ergo, like, we're just going to accept it. It becomes a debate. And like, what's been cool about the last like 3 or 4 different proposals in Tezos is like, people actually want to understand what they're voting for in effect. And so there's a lot more clarity of thought around the explanation of Tezos proposals than I think there are in any other crypto project, because it's just sort of like, whoa, well, so-and-so said it. He's clever. Like, yes, no, he definitely is. But like, you know, we're just, you know, trying to go towards a goal, which is making a better cryptocurrency. As I mentioned, a lot of these things are secular goods. Like you want it to be faster. You want gas fees to be cheaper in theory. You want, you know, all these things to make the cryptocurrency more accessible to people. And I don't think that's always the conversation going on in other spaces. Whereas, you know, Tezos has obviously its own myriad issues, but as does every project and every, you know, group of people. But I do think one of the things that having this mechanism, this formal mechanism for proposals and this massive threshold has done that's been a positive is it's created a form of clarity in the conversations that don't exist elsewhere.
I think that's pretty incredible. And actually I think one of the promising things about crypto is the ability to have, you know, clarity of thought in discussions in a way that you can't have with our current modern political system. I mean, it's amazing, to live in the era that we live in now, and then, look back at history. I was reading, I read way back the Master of Senate, the Lyndon B. Johnson biography. And it's like, there's a history of it. Well, maybe, not 50 years ago or 70, but, 150 plus years ago, we actually had real debate, like real substantive debate and, in our halls of politics. And what I love about seeing some of the debates happen, I mean, some of them are filled with, some of these debate, these debate threads are filled with memes and things like that. Not that sovereign nations today don't use memes. I don't know if you saw Ukraine responding with a meme on Russia's invasion the other day. But,
yeah, it's like peak, 21st century.
21st century. But I really do love that aspect, like the fact that we might be able to get back to real thoughtful discourse, right, in a way that's productive and not necessarily based on politics. I think that's just a really fascinating promise.
Yeah, I mean, people trust the outcome of blockchains because they trust the process, right? Because it's all at the end of the day, you can see how a transaction came to be because you can actually query the code behind it, which is more than you can say for like most of the political decisions that you have. Now, mind you, there's still like a lot of pernicious stuff in the background or whatever of anything, right? Like, the way people make decisions is obviously not up to you, but like the forum in which they do it with the cryptocurrency as opposed to like what we're used to consuming, whether it's media, whether it's politics, is a bit more honest and transparent, only because it has to be, right? Otherwise, no one will use it. So, I mean, it's this way, not necessarily, for any noble reason, but because it has to be, which I think is a better cause, right, than just promulgation.
There's that John Maynard Keynes quote that I won't. Oh no, it's an Adam Smith quote. Sorry about I won't even attempt to butcher about. It is not by the. What is it? It is not by the goodwill of the baker that we get our bread, or something like that.
No.
Something like that. It is in their self-interest. He was much more eloquent than I'll even attempt to be. But same principle, basically. Actually, sorry, I just had this totally random thought when you were talking about the, like you could, in theory, give the entire control over to one address, right? To your point, like it's almost like speaking of enlightened dictators, right? Or rather, like when we say that sounds silly, and it probably is, but if you think, especially if that person ends up losing their private keys, but if you think about, ancient Rome, which, we look back on and we're like, okay, we could say, well, we've advanced a lot as a society, but if you think about it, the Roman Republic lasted longer, as a republic than, the United States has so far. So they probably had a lot to learn, but they actually had mechanisms for, allowing dictators to take over in times of emergency. Of course, that ended up turning out badly for the democracy aspect of it. But I mean, that would just be such a fascinating thought if suddenly everyone voted and said, okay, well, the best thing is to, foist all the power onto this person. And to your point, the best people, even again, going back to Plato, he writes about this, the best people who you want in power are the people who don't want the power, right? Like the people who are the sort of philosopher kings or whatever whatever term you
not even your George Washingtons, right? Like, I don't want to be king.
That's right.
You kind of want like sort of unwilling smart people who are like a little bit like, oh crap, well, I've got to do this. And that's clearly not what we have right now. So, but I do think like the sort of barrier to understanding this space, which has been overwhelmingly like, it's been a mixed bag to watch, to be honest. I think one of the nicer parts of it is like, if you are just such a hardcore nerd that you know so much about like distributed networking that, that you're that in the weeds, like it is something to be said for the fact that like your main interest probably isn't seizing control and being some sort of like absolute dictator. Like you probably do have some other, qualities about you. Whereas, the people who just want to go into politics and like sort of, control everyone else are usually like, at their best, they're high functioning sociopaths. So at least in my experience, like obviously I don't have very many nice things to say about politicians, but that's just who I am. Can't help it.
Well, there's a lot that we can discuss there, but maybe perhaps, tell us about acute art, and actually maybe even less about that and just more about the metaverse and NFTs. Obviously a hot topic item, which I think we find fascinating, right? Because, actually back in the old Oculus days, our biggest conference room was called Metaverse, right? And I think a lot of VR companies saw themselves as Metaverse companies. It's just in 2014, 15, if you called yourself a Metaverse company, people would kind of roll their eyes and say, what is that? So I think we all find it very hilarious that now, many years later, it's a term that, you know, people
are using flippantly, yeah, as of several months ago.
That's right.
But yeah, no, it's funny. I think we're just basically living in you know, Neil Stephenson's world, and that's more or less what we're dealing with. We should just be reading his books a bit more carefully to figure out what the next few years have in store. The whole craze behind NFTs is kind of like, I think partially a function of being all inside and having quarantine brain, which just I think makes you a little bit crazy. Being like, oh, I can, you know, I can like scroll through and buy art all day. Like, okay, cool. Like that's yeah, that's a way to pass your time. And then there's a flip side to this, which is like there are a lot of artists who, you know, are using algorithms and all sorts of novel ways to represent their thoughts and their commentary in the world, who haven't been able to monetize this effectively. And this is an outlet for them to do that, right? It's also a way for people to like, you know, collect things together and unite and show their taste in things. Not everyone can be an artist, but I do think a lot of people define themselves by their collections and by trying to show their you know, taste through different ways. Like obviously women tend to do this like with clothing, like, you know, talk to a girl about her handbag collection and you'll usually get like a bit more, several more paragraphs than you bargained for. And that's fine. I think that's great. Like, you know, I have a lot of like really intelligent like girlfriends who, you know, do retail therapy just to like kind of shut off for a little bit and reset. And I think that's fantastic. And I think this seems to be like a more male-oriented way of doing that. It's all cool. And it's not hurting anyone, you know? I do think that there's kind of been like a time and a place for this that was a little bit insane. Like there was effectively, you know, a craze, I guess, earlier this year that was really focused on like, you know, how much money can we get for X? And then you'd have all these like big publicity stunts. That seems to be like kind of fading away. And more organic platforms like, you know, Hikik, which again, like clearly I have a tremendous passion for, are kind of, you know, keeping up with their activity because they were they were built on the idea that like, oh, they get these VCs some big returns, so we have to like promote the shit out of, you know, every NFT drop. A lot of large IP holders have come to like either the Tezos Foundation or me or my husband, and they've, you know, effectively wanted to use NFTs as a way to unite fans. We've seen that with like F1. There's two Tezos Foundation sponsored cars, McLaren and Red Bull, and like, yeah, it's a great way to unite with fans. Like if you really love that like turn by Max Verstappen, you just think like, oh man, that was the coolest thing ever, which it was, by the way. We just saw the F1 championship and it was freaking awesome.
Yeah, you're in the Grand Prix, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And who doesn't want to show that they were a part of that or that they were there? Like it's exciting. Yeah. Like I still talk about like the Yankee games I went to growing up. And so you get fandom, and that's like a really nice way to basically show your wares and show your credibility and show that you're part of a group, right? And I think that's a lot of what the NFT stuff kind of harkens to. It's a dead simple idea, but what I like about it is that NFTs are effectively the gateway smart contract. Like once you start to say like, oh man, I own this thing and I just traded with my friend and it's kind of weird, but I dig it. I think you start to think a little bit more about digital ownership of assets, and then you start to think a little bit more about like, hey, what could I do if I, you know, kind of want to stretch the boundaries of this a little bit. One enormous success in the Tezos ecosystem that we had, you know, last week at Art Basel was that we basically had the only sort of cryptocurrency sponsored booth. There were 5,000 NFTs minted from this exhibit with Mario Klingemann's work, where people basically made their own NFT using an image that was distorted by an algorithm that Mario wrote himself. And through some cold fusion that this marketing director, Mark Soares, did, basically you were able to capture the NFT, see it on your phone, and have it downloaded and be able to send it to, you know, yourself or keep it in your wallet, whatever, within like 30 seconds. So this was enormously popular. There were lines out the door. And I think it was one of the most successful booths that Art Basel has ever had, because rarely do they let you interact with these things. So,
that's awesome.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's, for me, it's like the NFT thing, like on face value, it's like there's a lot of snark that could be made of it. I don't think it's like so revolutionary in the sense that it's not technically moving the ball forward very hard. Like this all could have been done in 2013. I just think the appetite for like basically representing your I guess fandom on the internet has changed a lot over the pandemic when we've all been very online. It has had mild rot in our brains, but I think it's mostly just been a way for people to like try to make connections with other people and try to like support people, and it's all been very positive, and a lot of the crypto stuff is mostly very negative. So I'm pretty happy that it's got a much more positive tone to it than it used to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating, and congrats on the progress on our Basil. I know how hard those those things can be to get people to get excited for anything, right? But that just sounds like a fabulous way to do it. And one of the, I mean, you talk about some of the problems with NFTs, and I'd be curious sort of get your thoughts, because a lot of, I mean, just to summarize, I mean, the thing I think well known now is a lot of NFTs aren't actually things, right? They're just pointers to, well, either they're sitting on largely centralized exchanges, NFT exchanges, or perhaps you did mint a true NFT, but what it is just pointing to some image or some video on your AWS server, basically, right? And it's like, okay, well, let's say even your company goes down, AWS goes down, when is that thing going to last? I mean, I think one thing I think I've heard you mention, and I'd love for to explore further, is like, what about putting things on IPFS as an example, right? Especially because I know certain blockchains, it's harder to put, for example, like text, right, or like just items, obviously, into the into the actual blockchain itself. So they're fascinating alternatives, but it does feel like the majority of NFTs today don't have sort of the intergenerational, there's so many points at which it will not last. I'd love to hear your thoughts about, generational lasting NFTs. Like, do those even exist today, or is it even possible to create them? Or
no, absolutely. So good question. And I think most people don't know how the internet works, and so they just assume like, oh, it's all blockchain. And to your point, like that doesn't really mean much unless you actually give it teeth. And so IPFS, Interplanetary File System, which is like a project of Filecoin. Juan's a great guy, and so IPFS is like basically an actual way to have like a distributed internet, and so Hickok used IPFS to basically mint most of its NFTs, and in fact the website went down for indefinitely a few weeks ago, and basically a mirror shot up within 2 hours, and so like basically all the work that was on Hickok shifted on over, and it's basically, you just see this as like what it is, which is the URL is basically a window into the Web3 universe, if you will. And it's a great transitory story, right? Because it just really means that there's no centralized control, in the sense that like all this stuff sits outside of the servers of the person who owns the domain, right? So I think most people don't know this. There have obviously been a lot of catastrophes with some other NFT projects where they're just like, oh, but I thought I would have. No, you don't. Like, devil's in the details. A lot of this stuff is unfortunately like super complicated to do, and there's some really trivial crap that's like gone horribly awry. Like my favorite is like some of these auction houses, Sodger auction houses have done some NFT auctions, and like I've only heard horror stories from like how the sausage is made on that one. And I'm like, if you're I would trust Sotheby's to like, basically store my Monet and do a great job of like arranging for the insurance, scheme on that, and finding a good buyer, and publicizing an auction. But like, we're not living in that world anymore, right? So like, I think there's a huge appetite for like basically honest vendors who like aren't trying to just kind of like fly by the seam of their pants and take like the first 25-year-old who says like, oh, I can program a smart contract. Like, actually this is a skill, and actually the web is a really complicated mistress, in the sense that like even really subtle parts of the web are very poorly understood by even your best security engineer. And honestly, like if you are going through a conversation with someone and you ask them for a wide range of disciplines, a bunch of questions, and they answer confidently with all those things, the last thing you should do is hire that person. Like the best attorneys will, basically have like a very narrow focus for what they will actually give you, recommendations for, and then they'll kick you over to like a really good associate if it's even remotely outside of their domain. And I think you can use the same principle with software engineers, especially because a lot of this stuff is acquired skills. Smart contracts haven't really been around for more than 6 years. So it's kind of impossible to assume that like just because someone was really good in one discipline, they'd be really good in another. It takes a lot of humility, and I've noticed that when a lot of money's on the line, that's usually the first thing goes out the door.
There's a quote, I think it's Emily Bronte. It's proud people breed such sad sorrows for themselves. And I think that rings very true.
Yeah.
One has to have the humility to realize how little we know. So let's say, I mean, I like to do the thought experiment of, what would happen if Shakespeare could mint NFTs, right? Back in the day, right? Like that's all he could do. And so what do you have? I mean, just I'm trying to think about what happens if someone mints an NFT that's of value and, it continues to accrue value over the foreseeable future. Like, what does that model even sort of look like, or what could it look like, right? So, we know we have a lot of art in any era, right, including ours. There's a lot of art, there's a lot of things created, and the vast majority of them are forgotten, right? And the very few things, the Monets, the Shakespeares, the whoever, Charles Dickens, pick your artist, will survive. But a lot of times people don't even know that what will survive, right? A good example is, Herman Melville, writer of one of the great American novels, if not the great American novel, died thinking he was a failure because Moby Dick wasn't successful and everything he wrote after wasn't successful. And then 100 years later or something, or many decades later, somebody picked up the book and was like, hey, this is good, wrote about it in a popular publication.
It's worse than that. I mean, Nikola Tesla probably had the same exact idea when he died alone in a hotel, right? Like,
that's right.
and Elon Musk probably beg to differ. So it's some people, genius isn't always appreciated in its time.
That's right.
And I think part of what our generation has to suss out, which I don't think cryptocurrency is helping. In an age where creating content is effortless and basically anyone can do it, how do we organize around our values, right? It's really tough. And the internet is amazing in some ways. Like, you can find the only other person in the world who thinks Hyacinth Bouquet from the 90s, sitcom Keeping Up Appearances is a sex goddess. Like, you can find that person on the web, whereas you would otherwise be shit out of luck, 10, 20 years ago. And I think that's what's the best part about the internet. The worst part about the internet is that people are basically robbed of the ability to kind of be a little bit weird without kind of mob rule coming around them. And then basically obviously the internet's more or less a popularity contest in some of the other venues of it. So for me, it kind of cuts both ways. You can kind of find your tribe, but you also have to face the fact that Google is more or less the way that you would have to sort through that. And there's a lot of popularity and sort of bad curation that happens on the way there. So it's the internet's really hard to navigate, but it's also a treasure trove. And you have to be very careful about it. So I don't know. I mean, I've noticed that I have very unpopular tastes in pretty much everything that I do. So obviously the internet is fantastic for me because I'm a total weirdo and I can find my other weirdos. But it does make me wonder in the context of talking about value and finding genius, frankly, what does that look like? We don't have as many curatorial structures that kind of tell us what to like anymore. It's kind of TikTok is kind of everyone's view into culture now. And I don't think it's a bad thing, but it also, it also changes the landscape of how people, consume information and consume beauty and work. And I mean, this is more of a challenge for you than anyone else, right? Because you have a content component to your studio, and making stuff that's going to be a hit, whether it's for a niche group, it's literally a matter of cost economics for you.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of looking at history. I mean, the economics mattered so much to Michelangelo and a bunch of other artists that you think just created because they just got divine inspiration. But the commercial aspect really does drive a lot of art, even historically. So that's an interesting question, and I wonder how that gets structured, right? So, for example, let's say you make an NFT and you have 5% that goes to in secondary sales, 5% that goes to the original minter of the token. If it does become valuable 100 years later, do you just bequeath those private keys to your ancestors, and then is it 500 years later would we be paying royalties to that wallet, to perform Hamlet? I don't know. I'm so curious how this is going to work.
I think that becomes a turnoff, right? I think this stuff has to be managed through DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, because basically the idea of inheriting digital goods on the web is so incoherent that we haven't even begun to even dump shit your Facebook profile, ooh, do you want to give it to me? It's a weird question. It's all very weird. And I don't know, maybe I just want all my Gmails to be destroyed because no one has to know what a goddamn weirdo I am. And so it's kind of what do you actually want to display? How do you want to preserve it? My favorite NFT trend in the early part of this year was there were a lot of platforms that said that they would be able to enforce royalties, and they weren't. And it was so lazy because it was really fun because I'd go on a call with them and I'd ask them 2 questions and they'd be like, whoa. And there's nothing I love more than catching people in lies. But Well, that's to say, it's been a lot of like misinformation, plus like there's been a lot of storytelling, there hasn't been a lot of programming. And I think basically like you've got this narrative of like, our beautiful Web 3.0, future. And then you have like decentralized exchanges that are down because an Amazon Web Services, center in Virginia was down for like 8 hours the other day. It's like, that's not the decentralized future I was given, but it's probably the one I deserved. But it's it's a lot of that stuff going on. So I mean, honestly, like, my response to that is twofold. I think like, basically we need digital primitives for these digital goods. If it's all going to be on the web anyhow, then like we need basically a common accounting system that just isn't going to exactly translate to a trust. And then I also think that there's like so much goddamn laziness in this space, especially with some of the people who are like really actively promoting this as like the future, that you're going to get a lot of people like basically following them like lemmings and then realizing that they're going off a cliff, right? And once that's over, I'll still be here. And so I'm kind of looking forward to that, phase of this particular crypto cycle, because there's been a lot of hot air. When I look at like traditional common law when it comes to like inheritance and how you basically distribute assets, there's just not a good mapping for a lot of the digital stuff, because there's not a good way to value it. There's not a good way to like, transfer ownership. And there's so many problems with like custody and things like this that like, honestly, I'm just counting on Diogo Monica from Anchorage to solve these problems. But I think it's going to wind up looking a lot like DAOs and a lot less like, the estate of Charles Dickens or whatever, like trying to litigate, or I guess Disney does a lot of litigation to make sure that its stuff doesn't go into, everyone could use. But all that's to say, it's kind of hard to know who's going to advocate for you. But I do think like being extra pernicious and extra aggressive at the forefront doesn't exactly lend itself to people adopting you when you've got free content, over yonder that everyone likes almost as much.
Yeah, I think, I mean, speaking of, digital inheritance, I guess, in Facebook, it's like, they say like remembering John Smith or whatever, right? And it kind of, when you think about, and speaking of people having your data basically after you're gone, it's like, I remember there was this is like way long ago, but I was in San Francisco. It was almost a decade ago, but there was like a bill. This is before San Francisco had like all the tech billboards. Now it's just filled with tech billboards, but it had something that said your web history will outlive you. And that was, at that time, I guess a decade ago. I mean, now it's not at all shocking, but I was like, that woke me up to, wow, yeah, everything I do might be it's like, they look at people's journals, if you think back hundreds of years ago, it's like, okay, you look at what people wrote in their journals. Well, now you can just see what someone texted on a Tuesday afternoon at, 2:34 or whatever, what they got for breakfast, right? Yeah, it's a weird world to think about. We'll have so much more data to mine, and that's, I don't know, is that good or bad thing for humanity? I don't know. And who's going to own it?
Yeah, my husband would see it as a good thing, right? If you care about longevity, you should care about being able to recreate yourself in some form. And basically by, pumping out as much data as humanly possible, right? Like, that is a form of immortality in some ways. To be prolific and to be, remembered for many years is certainly like one way, to go gracefully. I think it's more often the case if you look back at historical figures, like you've got their public correspondence and what they've contributed, and then you have like the private reality. And I think before, or rather in an age that wasn't digital, it was the case that you could kind of get away with being a raging asshole in private, as long as you were, I don't know, contributing to like, physics, and you mostly remember the physics bits and not the bits where you were like, abusive to like all of the women in your life or something like that. And I do wonder how that's going to play out, because kind of like you have to be a fully formed like good human now, which isn't the worst thing in the world. I'm not trying to say it's a bad thing, but it does it changes the landscape of how you preserve yourself over time, and how people remember you. And I do wonder how that plays out in an age where like people are complicated, like no one's perfect, and like people make tons of mistakes, and a lot of it's captured. I think of like, I kind of adore her in the most like oddball relationship way, but like dojacat is like the most like no filter pop star that we've ever had, right? Like everyone else has been polished and going on stage with like their Britney mic, and she's just tweeting about like all sorts of weird shit on a Saturday night, and it's like, well, she's got a larger streaming base than Taylor Swift, so maybe like polish isn't what we are in the market for in this day and age. And maybe like the next generation is just going to be a bit more real than the rest of us, because they won't have these sort of lofty expectations for how, performative people are.
Yeah, I think authenticity is at such a premium now. I mean, it's interesting to see current like stars in the old paradigm, try to make it on TikTok, for example. Like, I mean, The Rock is doing a great job, right? I would say like Jason Derulo is doing a great job on TikTok. And then there are others who, aren't doing as well. And you really wonder what the sort of the formula for that transition is. Like another unfiltered, I guess, person that like, it's great to see Cardi B just riff, for example, right?
Yeah.
Just go at it. I remember in the early days of coronavirus, I was looking at some of those pronouncements, and it's almost like, it's almost like you're getting just a direct connection to some force out there, because it's just almost coming straight through the screen to your to your TikTok effectively.
Yeah, I mean, Cardi B's got a beef with Peppa Pig. So I mean, if you're picking on cartoon characters, I can think of nothing more authentic and bizarre than just like making your gripe with the way a cartoon pig puts on rain boots. So yeah, I think it's completely been turned on its head, because I think of like when I was growing up, you kind of had like the instinct Backstreet Boys, like who needed to be like all prim and polished, and oh my god, one of them is gay, and like now it's something you totally you wouldn't be ashamed of, right? And not that you should have been in the first place. So I think it's something that we ought to celebrate overall. But I do think when you talk about like digital legacy, it's something that complicates it tremendously, because some things obviously fall out of fashion really quickly. The internet's forever. So it's a tough one. I hope it gives us more empathy though. Like I do notice with this generation, like the younger, like 20 somethings that I know, it does seem to be a lot more high empathy than I would have expected. And I don't know, the kids are all right in general. And so I do kind of wonder, there's kind of these two conflicting forces with like the amount of information that's out there, but then there's also better tools for, kind of going through them than ever before. There's a lot of really great progress being done in machine learning and all sorts of parts of AI that kind of, I don't know if you've ever played around with GPT-3, but it's pretty awesome to basically ask questions to someone and have their entire repository of writing readily available to you, so that you can kind of probe in and kind of get a picture of their personality, if nothing else at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think there's so much more to explore there, but I do want to hit on the, of course, the topic of, the topic of the metaverse and the blockchain. Are those inextricably tied together or not? Because there are a lot of companies now trying to do this, the metaverse. And I think there's varying opinions, right? I mean, I would say as an example, probably the company formerly known as Facebook, aka Meta, probably doesn't think that those two have to go together, is my guess, right? But there are others who think that they absolutely do have to go together. Maybe that's a non-consensus view. But I'm curious about your views about that, or even just is the metaverse a thing, right?
I mean, listen, I think there's an idea of like taking your digital identity, and I think there's a market for basically being able to port it between places. And mind you, in like 2017, when people are talking about Web3 with blockchains, they sounded like tinfoil hat people, because they're basically like, yeah, because Facebook could take all your data and then, and it was like, okay, like, maybe like stop, you're harshing our mellow, quit it, that's never going to happen. But then you've seen people like be, basically systemically deplatformed from different payments, channels, different, obviously Facebook has had its own like weird relationship with, all sorts of vendors. And then, Twitter banned the president of the United States. Like, I mean, crap. Now, mind you, I don't think that's censorship with a capital C, because these are private companies and I'm not a crazy person. But I do think it does make you think like, hey, if I'm spending 8 hours a day on this website, and like you're a content creator, like what's my backup? What's my recourse to basically reclaim my fan base if one day YouTube decides that I'm like not a good actor? So I think that like these tech companies have basically created this problem for themselves, and it's something that like really wasn't appealing part of the cryptocurrency space in 2017. It genuinely sounded very crazy, and now it's like, oh yeah, it would be good if you could make sure that everyone had their YouTube content backed up on like some sort of weird mirror site. I think like for me the concept of the metaverse, the way it ties into a blockchain, is basically having assets that can sit across many different places that basically the 2.0 version of the web acts as an entry point to the 3.0 version of the web, which is something that like sits in a very unorganized filing cabinet that you systemically take out, with some thought behind it. I think that's a pretty mild version. This is kind of the hic-ic-nunc, like, a person goes a little wacky one day, takes down the website. Okay, no problem. Like, we have a parallel website, nothing's been lost. And that would be great for some of the people who, have unpopular opinions on Twitter and get, banned. And maybe you're just like, actually, I kind of want the censored version because maybe I think like Donald Trump is really offensive to my personality and I want the garden where he's out and I'm okay. The problem is a lot of this stuff has appealed to like the alt-right and people who generally have like very otherwise like intolerable views and like sort of polite society. And that's like a big problem with the marketing around it. It's like, it's been crypto bros, alt-right people, and sort of tinfoil hat folks who like hate Mark Zuckerberg's face. And I think like it's kind of breaking out of that because even my sort of polite friends who don't know anything about cryptocurrencies will say like, I mean, shit, Twitter banned the president. That's a lot of power to give. And clearly he loved Twitter. So now he just like posts press releases that people screenshot and put on Twitter. But anyway, all that's to say, like, I do think there's an appetite for being able to take your assets. And if you are spending a lot of time on your mobile phone, on Twitter or whatever, being able to kind of port that to another mechanism. But I don't think it's like this weird radical, like you're going to own everything. Because at the end of the day, people are truly lazy. I don't think there's actually an appetite for radical decentralized, sort of ownership over everything. Even running your own server for email is like a massive pain in the ass, and Google doesn't make it easy for you either. All that's to say, I think like there's an appetite in some corners of the internet, but realistically, people are way too goddamn lazy to actually enact a lot of this. So they have to be given some sort of middleware solution between like something that's pretty radically Web3, maybe backed up in IPFS, and something that's like, spoon-fed to them from like the Meta portfolio of apps that, clearly they've abused their trust with their sort of user base, and now it's being taken away from them effectively. But I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are, because I just threw out a lot of stuff from you.
Yeah, compared to the beginning of, well, this phase of VR, because VR has had for decades, it's kind of ups and downs, in terms of its interest as an industry. And I think that there are different views on like the metaverse, right? So in many ways, I feel like I know less than the start, just because, there's been so much that's happened and so much that's unexpected. I guess one question that it's hard to know for sure is VR required for the metaverse, right? I mean, I think Meta, Facebook would say, yes, metaverse is kind of inextricably tied to VR, right? And then there are others that don't think that that's necessarily true. I actually think I saw a tweet just yesterday that said, maybe Zoom is the metaverse company we were all, looking for, right? So what's the definition of the metaverse? No one seems to have like, a cohesive definition, though I would say Meta's definition definitely includes the metaverse, but, Epic Games with Fortnite, Roblox or Minecraft, they probably would not say you need VR for it. So I think that's one question. Will VR and AR be the platform that succeeds mobile? That's an open question. I don't know if that's true or not, but there are different views. In fact, Facebook's, there's this great sort of article that came out several years ago about Facebook's motivation to buy Unity, the game engine. And that was because they wanted to hasten the move from mobile to the next computing platform. And I think Facebook is very, or Meta, I should say, Meta is very concerned that it doesn't have that direct, last mile to the consumer, like with the hardware, right? And I think with the Meta Quest and other things, they have an opportunity to do that. And then will blockchain be inextricably tied together? I think probably, but I think jury's out. I mean, by that, I mean, if you have a metaverse where everything you can do in the real world, you can do in the virtual world, but if the economic system is tied to the blockchain, I mean, that's an interesting thought, right? Because you can control every aspect, right? You could control, well, do I want my background to be blue, or do I want it to be the white snow out here? And that might have to be something you have to actually, pay for. Whereas, if I'm in reality, I don't have to do that. I mean, it leads to a system where, of course, we're no longer on the gold standard, obviously, for many decades. But you wonder if, there could be a world, and I'm not saying this is definitely going to be true, but a tantalizing possibility is perhaps a metaverse-based economy, meaning it's like us being on the gold standard, this metaverse economy is on a blockchain, right? As the blockchain standard, we can't be printing trillions of dollars of stimulus money. We have a central bank governing it all. There's no reason why that couldn't then translate to the real world, right? Where in some far future, maybe we're pegged, not to gold or some other commodity, but maybe we're pegged to a blockchain, right?
Yeah, well, some people in the Tezos ecosystem have recently done sort of a trial project with EVE Online, which is of course a very popular in Europe MMORPG. And I remember I met Hilmar several years ago. He's the CEO there, and he was like, "Listen, I have like 20 years of like people." To our earlier point, like spending 8 hours a day of their life, like trying to build currency in this, and all that currency sits on my servers. That's a liability. Like, you want to do right by the people who are like investing their time in playing your game. And sometimes the only right thing to do is actually cede some of the, control that you have. Because at the end of the day, if you want to like imbue trust in a system, it's kind of a liability to be running this like complex server organization in Iceland when people all across the globe are depending upon you. So a blockchain gives you that kind of for free. What we've seen is that basically people are very reticent to like actually give control to other people, right? So Unity is actually a pretty great example. It's kind of preposterous that it's a gaming engine that's done so well because it's like open in so many facets, and it's allowed a lot of people to like make their own games, and it's kind of uniquely beautiful in that respect. But it's been really hard, to see people like thinking of the Apple Epic battle, to see people like give up control of their walled gardens. And there's a reason for that. It was very easy to do that in Web 2.0. But like the next phase of the web hopefully will be built with this stuff in mind. And so we'll have primitives that allow you to basically have a better accounting system that people can trust. Because that's effectively all a blockchain is. It's a way for people who otherwise wouldn't trust each other to basically like put their guard down and be like, okay, so we're just going to like cede that the computation that's going on here is something we agree upon. It's kind of like a neutral territory, and obviously there's going to be hacks and scams and things like this. But it's like, listen, man, if you didn't look into this and look under the rug and kind of caveat emptor, it's going to be a little dicey at first, but like quickly, even in the crypto space, we've converged on standards for things like the way wallets are constructed, so on and so forth. So I mean, I think it's going to take like a really bold visionary to kind of create something that basically puts their arms behind their back with some of the accounting system for these types of things. My 2 cents on the metaverse question, because I've gotten several emails from people of varying credibility who've been telling me about the metaverse company that they're going to start. I'm like, oh Christ, what has Zuckerberg done now with creating a meme that everyone has in their head? But it's kind of like I don't think you can deliberately do that. I think it has to be something that's organic, like Zoom inadvertently becoming the metaverse is kind of what's going to have to happen. You kind of fall ass backwards into kind of being a place where people actually like to gather. And I think that's more likely to happen if you give them an open field and you actually give them some means of trusting the way you set things up, rather than trying to manufacture it to again optimize for a pitch deck.
I think those are wonderful points. And, I love the EVE Online analogy or rather parable there, because it's just such a fascinating thing. I mean, I think there's a book called Empires of Eve, but it's just so fascinating to see like, people, trying to kick the Russians out. So the Russians, and there's only a few of them, are like staying up all night, trying to keep their sector safe. And then there's those YouTube videos of like the time lapse of the EVE Online universe and like the powers that rise and fall. Those are fascinating, and like a lot of the empires have like meme names, and it's just great to see that. That was just so far ahead of its time in a lot of ways.
Well, one thing that's really captivating about listening to Hilmar speak is that he's not like trying to like control anything. He's like, I am the janitor here. I am making sure that everything is clean so you guys can like go in the hallway and do whatever you have to do. And I think that's a great attitude of like stewardship towards any of these projects. And that's probably the reason that it's like one of the most successful MMORPGs of all time, is basically because it's like truly community run. So I've learned a lot from being friends with him over the last few years, and like basically he's extraordinarily generous to me in the sense that like if I ask like, hey, like can I talk to a community manager for EVE Online, like he'll actually let me do that. And yeah, there's a lot of I think that's kind of the model that will succeed, because it's the one that actually accepts that the internet is a social phenomenon. And it's not something that you can basically like manufacture or kind of game too much, because like at the end of the day, you know, Dogecoin is going to go and become like the bellwether for the cryptocurrency space because a bunch of teenagers on TikTok say so. And like, if you don't embrace the absurdity of that, it's going to drive you insane. So I think you're not with it, you know, run from it. So,
yeah.
And that's really the way I try to think about Tezos. Like, you know, again, like, there's all sorts of weird crap that's going to come in, and if you don't make it a place where people can actually like say their crazy ideas, you're gonna miss out on like what the next big one is.
I think, I mean, you made at the very beginning of this a Dark Knight reference. So I mean, I think what you're referring to is like, I guess in the Dark Knight, Heath Ledger's Joker talking about how the sort of the chaos, right? It just effectively being the agent of chaos. And you know, he's like a dog running around. If he even caught a car, he wouldn't even know what to do with it. I mean, you know, in many ways that, you know, I mean, the frightening thing about that is it makes sense, you know, like in the sense of, okay, well, that's actually what's happening. But yeah, I think those who can't embrace it really, you know, I think it's sort of a different era for them. Yeah, I guess, I mean, and talking about your the story of stewardship with EVE Online is just so cool because, you know, like, let's take the flip side. I mean, I think Epic Games is doing great things to the metaverse, right? The engines they created are great, but the you know, like I like playing Fortnite, right? I still have a little phone that still has the Fortnite app on it. And apparently that's, you know, people are selling those on eBay or whatever. But, you know, because of what happened with Apple and Epic and there are just arguments, I, you know, loaded up on my fancy new, you know, MacBook Pro that supposedly can play Fortnite really well. And they actually just totally broke this past break and Thanksgiving. I tried to load up Fortnite and it actually, you cannot play with PC players anymore as of like just a few weeks ago. So even Macs can't, and this used to not be the thing. So, you know, politics getting in the way of people just wanting to play some games, whereas I think an open system dedicated to stewardship doesn't necessarily do that.
It's clearly a symptom of like a transitory period though, right? Like the fact that Tim Sweeney picked this fight, you know, he's a smart dude. You know, the fact that he picked this fight, I don't think he wanted to lose anything, right? But there must be some sort of inflection point coming, right? Where we're basically like, it used to be a perfectly acceptable business model to basically like take off a portion of the web and have your walled garden. I think like what people have seen is basically that this creates like very contentious business practices between different vendors, and it creates like a very twisted dynamic where like, you know, in effect, consumers don't feel as though they have the most empowerment. And I think there's an opportunity for someone to come in and just be bold. So like Ubisoft made a big announcement that they're using Tezos for some items in the new game that they're using. And I think this, I think it's kind of like trying to get goodwill with users. You know, it remains to be seen how successful that venture will be, but I do think it's a very similar model of a lot of these gaming companies are kind of looking at like, oh crap, like, you know, they have built these systems and these economies, and actually it's a bit of a liability, and you can kind of be cannibalized by your own success if you don't put the right relationships in place very early on.
What drives you the most? What drives Kathleen Breitman to do what you do?
Well, geez, I mean, you know, it helps being married to your co-founder. I really like, one of the things that I find very pleasurable about working with my husband is that communication is more or less effortless. And I know very few people who I want to know as intimately well as I know my husband. And like, this is a kind of a continued way for us to like explore different spaces, work together, do problem solving, largely just be there for each other. So it happens to be the case that I think this is also at the intersection of a bunch of stuff that is deeply relevant. And you know, for how much I can complain sometimes about like, oh, I do a lot of speaking engagements and I travel quite a bit. Like, I complain about that a little bit, but like, I'd also be really sad if I stopped getting invitations to things. Like, I do like being kind of at the edge of the volcano and people being interested in what I have to say. But mostly like, you know, the 9 to 5 or like 9 to 9 or whatever, of actually working. The thing that gets me going is that I have like someone who's really, really, really intelligent, who basically like I learn a lot from and who I I get to like pal around with, and we have our own internal sense of humor and our own internal way of approaching things. So it's a very corny answer, but I would say it's mostly like that I basically get to mine like someone who I think is like, you know, truly very brilliant all day, and it's work, right? So for me, that's the big plus. And then, you know, on top of that, I do think that this, for whatever reason, like this really crested, and I didn't expect for it to crest like within, you know, 10 years of when I kind of, you know, quit my job and started doing this full time. So like for me, I'm the dog who caught the bus, because like a lot of the crypto conversation has sped up a lot in the last 5 years. I really didn't expect it to.
I think it's great. I think that's the best answer. I mean, it's so you're in such a lucky position in that sense of, you know, having the ability to do that. So I think that's very special, and having found something special. Great. What's the future hold for Tezos, for Q? I know we didn't talk a lot about QR. We kind of talked around it, but and I guess what you're doing with Trilly, what's the future hold?
Yeah, it's a good question. Honestly, like, you know, the Tezos ecosystem has really taken off, I would say, this year. I would say it's a combination of like the NFT space really like buoyed and got like a lot of people super interested in it as a platform. And then a lot of the developer tooling around the ecosystem has just been made enormously easier over the last like 18 months or so. So it's a combination of like people are coming for the NFTs, but they're staying for the developer tools, you know what I mean? And so that's been fantastic. So like we're seeing a lot of experimentation. There's a lot of really cool projects going on. There's some stuff in like domain name services, and there's some stuff in, you know, trying to represent different traditional financial assets on a blockchain. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on with distributed computing and like basically how to improve the Tezos, you know, blockchain and its, you know, scaling and all that good stuff. So there's some like really quality stuff. There's some more meme things. There's some really great games coming out, you know, over the next year or so. So yeah, I mean, like I'm super jazzed. I haven't been this excited in a really long time, because for a while it was like, it was a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. It was really hard to find developer tooling, or refine developer tooling, because there just wasn't that much like tinkering. Now there's a lot more tinkering, and that's like improving the developer tooling. So it's created this like really virtuous cycle. And there's a lot of like super talented people who are working on this now. And I think for a while, the whole crypto space really suffered from like a recruitment problem for obvious reasons, because like it really wasn't doing itself a lot of favors. And so that, I would say, that changed a lot pretty radically in 2019. And we finally kind of got the Tezos ecosystem, you know, basically to capture that. So yeah, it's been great. The whole Web 3.0 vision is so talked about on Twitter that I have friends from other industries who are complaining to me about it, and I'm like,
yeah.
They're like, can your people stop talking about Web 3? I'm like, if I controlled crypto Twitter, I'd be a very powerful lady indeed. But alas, I do not. So yeah, it's just great to be at a moment in time where like people know a lot more about my industry than I often do about theirs.
Yeah. I think it's great. What do you do for fun outside of the you know 9 to 9 plus? I'm sure, but what in the few moments you get?
Yeah, that's a good question. I like to turn my brain off. I like to watch really dumb TV. I love joking around. I keep up with a lot of my friends. I would say that like, you know, my hobby, insofar as I have one, is just like goofing off with like, you know, people who don't have the same discipline as me. And I don't know if that's learning or just being sociable, but you know, I like goofing around. I like refining my sense of humor, shall we say. And I like really bad TV. So I think that.
What bad TV? I mean, you know, I'm curious.
Oh, well, I mean, Real Housewives this season, Salt Lake City. I mean, I'm just loving all of this. Like, it's at the inflection of so many things I love. It's like these people are awful, and like they're all trying to figure out like, you know, how much in trouble each other is, and it's just amazing. So that's the gift that keeps on giving. So say hello to them when you see them in Salt Lake. And you know, Real Housewives hasn't been this entertaining in several seasons, but I'm loving the whole like quarantine dynamics. There's like a woman who's you know, allegedly a cult leader, and they're all like so dopey, and they're just like, well, that's why she was paying for all these things. Like, yeah, absolutely. So I love that. Succession has also been amazing this season. That's not bad TV though. That's excellent TV, but it's only excellent insofar as the people are so bad. trying to think of other TV I like, but no, those are like the two big ones. I'm definitely like turning my brain off with I sing the Oscar the Grouch song, I Love Trash, whenever I'm about to watch Real Housewives. Anything dirty or dingy or dusty, anything rowdy or rotted and rusty. But I love it because it's trash. Anyway, that's the secret underbelly. You got to the heart, it took you an hour and a half, but that's my cryptic secret.
Well, I'll have to say, and this is something you don't get until you travel, but I think, San Francisco TikTok versus Utah TikTok, I think Utah TikTok has actually been pretty influenced by the Real Housewives season from what I can gather. So if you ever make it out here, or I guess you can look at the hashtags, but it's interesting to see the evolution of that, which I would not have guessed. That's an insight I would not have guessed when I'm moving to Park City.
Well, one of my friends got like dragged into cartel TikTok, and I'm like, I need to stay off this app because if I start going and watching like Mexican drug cartels like entertaining each other, I can't, like, I'm not going to be able to turn away. Like, this is very potent stuff, And I just, if I could bottle that, I would. But it's just, TikTok is truly one of the better social innovations we've had in the last 20 years. I say this as someone who doesn't understand Snapchat, of course, but it's
totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I think it's taken the most addictive aspects of bad/good TV and bottled it up into like 30-second to a few minutes long things and just like throwing it at you endlessly, endless newsfeed. So,
and it's also like so much better than talking about like the power of decentralization. So much better than SNL ever was. Like, totally. My husband, I'll tease him because he's not here. He has. I hope to have faith in something the way he has faith that SNL will make a funny clip. Because like he'll watch it every Sunday morning and just be like perusing for anything that will like even get a snicker, and I'm like, dude, you got to go on TikTok for like 5 minutes and you're gonna get way better content. So let the teenage wisdom of the crowd speak its mind instead of like I don't know who's writing for SNL now, but it's been awful since as long as I can remember. But all that's to say, long TikTok, long Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, as long as they're continuing to recruit cult leaders as their thing, and long Secession, as long as we've got like Kieran Culkin being the little shit that he is.
I agree with all those, though of course past success does not equal future returns and yada yada yada, all that. But yes, we have Kathleen Breitman's official longs, Long Housewives, the Real Housewives. I love it. I think on that high note, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your insights. And thank you for the conversation. As always, a really fun one.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.